certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Today, the court heard startling admissions of error in vital evidence from the murder scenes. Welcome to day 26 of Claremont in Conversation. Natalie Bongiolo with Legal Affairs Editor Tim Clark and forensic scientist Brendan Chapman, who we, as well as our listeners who have plenty of questions for. But Tim, I think, can you just start us off by telling us a little bit about today? Today was about Ciara, and just like when Jane Rimmer went missing, you were given a glimpse into Ciara's private world through these forensic photographs.
Yeah, that's right, Nat. So, as you said, when both girls went missing, the police swooped into action almost immediately. And obviously, Ciara being the third in the sequence, the macro task force was up and running in massive sense by then. So when she did go missing, it became obvious today, and it has been obvious for years, that the police were immediately on high alert. And today we heard from Sergeant Alexander Wells, another forensic officer who was part of the WA Police at the time, and how he was tasked to go to the Glennons' family home where Ciara was living, and to take photographs, take exhibits, evidence that might help in what was then a missing persons case. And so those photographs were shown in court today, and they showed mostly Ciara's bedroom, but also Ciara's office, where she'd just begun her work again as a lawyer. They showed a car that police at the time thought she might have driven at some stage. But the most poignant and the most heartrending really were the pictures of Ciara's room in her parents' house, which showed all the trappings of a young professional woman who'd appeared maybe had left for work in a little bit of a rush that morning. Clothes scattered on a spare bed, various pairs of shoes in front of the mirror, which it would appear that she'd be tried on before she'd left for work. Her hairbrushes, her shampoo, her international driver's permit, even a book that she was reading at the time, all frozen in time in these photographs that were taken hours after she went missing, and now obviously we know hours after she was murdered.
And what sort of items were taken from the Glennon household?
All sorts of things. As I say, books, clothes, hairbrushes, hair bands, friendship bracelets, some underwear was taken. Anything the police at the time thought might give them a clue, and also might give them a better picture of who Ciara was at the time. An exercise book that she was writing in, a wide range of things, and also some things that you might not think on the list that was flashed up in court today. Fur samples were taken from the Glennon family dogs, for example, and then later on we know that fibre samples were certainly taken from various places: Mr. Glennon's car, Ciara's office, other items within Ciara's office, and other spots around the Glennon family home as well, which we now know were very prescient samples to take, because fibres become so important in the case, and have been and will be.
And Brendan, you might be able to talk to us about this a little bit. How important are these kinds of items, hairbrushes, and I think also a razor was taken later, and a toothbrush? How important are these in a case such as this down the track?
Yeah, in a missing persons case where we have not yet identified a body or where the missing person is, one of the important things we need to establish is obtaining what we call a reference sample for DNA particularly. And we look to sources like hairbrushes, toothbrushes, hair bands, anything containing biological material of the missing person, so that we can kind of get the ball rolling on testing them and establishing a DNA result for what we know is the person. So when we do come to identifying a crime scene or any exhibits, we already have that on file. The opening stages of any investigation from a forensic perspective particularly are really dynamic. We don't know a lot in the early stages, and so we've got this constant flow of information that's coming in as detectives kind of pound the pavement, so to speak, and find out information. So we're kind of using our best guess, I suppose, to try and capture as much information as possible in the early stages, which is why we see detectives going to places like the Glennon house and photographing it and collecting that evidence, because until we get a picture of what's happened, it's always important to know the last movements of the person. And as you said, Tim, kind of that frozen in time imagery that you've seen in the court today helps us with identifying the last movements of the person. And my esteemed criminology colleagues will talk to you about establishing victimology and all that sort of stuff, which is outside of my expertise, absolutely.
Is it also standard practice that they would collect items from other people who live in that house to exclude them in any way, or just so that they have those items as well?
Yeah, depending on the circumstances. In a family home like this, sometimes you can have the compounding issue of people actually share DNA. There's shared parts of the DNA from parents and siblings. So that can certainly help in collecting evidence from other people, and particularly then, and as we've seen with this case, with respect to fibres from people around the missing person.
So is it a case that the more samples of someone's DNA you have from multiple sources, the better and clearer and concise a picture of their DNA you get?
Not necessarily. We could take one hair and get the entire picture of someone's DNA, but we don't want to go to their house, interfere with their family, and come home with one hair and have that not work, and then have to go back and intrude again and again and again. So and hair is one of those sources that can be highly variable in its ability to recover DNA. So if we take a number of sources, then we hopefully guarantee not to have to go back and get another sample.
Tim, so Gary Hyde was back on the stand. This is the former senior constable who you heard from yesterday. What did you hear from him today? Was he under cross-examination?
Yes, he was, Nat, and for most of the morning, actually. So Sergeant Hyde was again forensic officer, was part of that team along with Rob Hemelar and others, and in particular was tasked with taking photographs and handling exhibits over quite a long span of the investigation, spanning as far into it as 2005. As we mentioned yesterday, it was in 1999 that he was tasked with packing up some critical exhibits that were then sent off to the US, and then in 2003 and 2005 he was tasked with counting them back, basically getting the boxes, opening the boxes up that contained these critical exhibits to check that they were all there and what sort of state they were in. So under cross-examination this morning, Mr. Jovich began sort of maybe pulling at a few strands of Mr. Hyde's evidence, Mr. Hyde's processes over the years, and just pointing out basically some discrepancies in recording things, labelling things, and as we've said, previously with other witnesses, just maybe Mr. Jovich trying to roughen up the edges of the neat and tidy prosecution case that they want to present. And he was relatively successful in that, I've got to say, Mr. Jovich. He did basically get Mr. Hyde, Sergeant Hyde, to admit that at times he had made errors in terms of labelling things, in terms of times that were logged on various things, exhibit numbers, and those type of things. But I've got to say, in terms of the handling of those critical exhibits, particularly the hair samples and the bags that were opened or not opened in the main case, which was of Ciara's mass hair sample, the bulk of Ciara's hair, Mr. Jovich didn't or couldn't find that Sergeant Hyde had done anything that might be deemed way beyond the pale or potentially catastrophic. So there were a few little holes punched in the prosecution case, but no major blows landed, if I was going to put it that way.
So there was talk, as you mentioned, about the bags and the opening and closing of bags. Did he say that he had opened a bag and specifically opened a bag all the way through to a sample, or that wasn't the case? There was bags in bags, and
yeah, so that's correct. So this is Ciara's, what they refer to as her hair mass. So this is the bulk of Ciara's hair that was removed from her body during the post-mortem and placed in an evidence bag. That had a particular label, AJM 54, and then that label changed down the track to VW1, and that's what it then became. And that was the label. That's the letters and numbers that will end up referring to a lot in the weeks and months to come. That VW1 sample, as I've explained, was sent over to the FBI and also sent over to Canberra and the AFP, and they both did some testing on that. And then when it would return to Australia finally in 2005, it was Mr. Hyde's job to open up the box that sample was in and to check that it was actually there, obviously, and what sort of state it was in. And what we found out today was the hair sample was in a bag, which was then inside another bag, which was alongside two other empty plastic bags, which would appear to have had been used in some process along the way. And Mr. Hyde explained how he was tasked to remove the two small empty plastic bags by opening up the big bag, taking them out, and then resealing it. But it was established pretty much beyond doubt that he never went any further than that and didn't touch the main hair sample in any way, shape or form.
I guess it sounds to me almost a little bit haphazard that there's these empty bags inside these other bags. Brendan, is there a really clear process for putting things into bags and keeping them separate?
It's a tough one, because you have to consider that in the first instance when an exhibit is collected, and I'll use an example of a hair mass, you have an exhibit that is given a unique number. Let's just for argument's sake call that ABC1. Now that exhibit is not a single part, and so when later examinations of that exhibit are done and say single hairs are pulled out for testing or single hairs are taken to another place or there's things found within that exhibit, often the case is to create then a sub-sample of that exhibit. And one of the key things we do in forensics is to ensure that every forensic exhibit has a unique identifier. So if we've taken something from this imaginary exhibit ABC1, we need to allocate it a new unique number. And so that's why you're seeing this kind of the best way of explaining it is parent exhibit and child exhibit. If you could imagine it almost like a family tree, where as new things are investigated, new sub-exhibits are coming off the exhibits. And that's where they take on kind of this new life. The other side of that is that independent agencies, be that policing, be that laboratories, they all have their own internal numbering system so that they can differentiate samples, and they take subsamples of subsamples. And so this is how we're seeing this one exhibit now referred to by multiple numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that yesterday we were talking about and saying trying to follow the numbers could be quite difficult, but that's a great way, if you picture it in your mind as a family tree, it lets you think quite clearly about where they all come from.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great analogy, Nat, and probably one that I'm now going to steal off you, Brendan, and use in my subsequent reports.
You're welcome to.
Because as I've just explained, the original... We'll take Ciara's here, for instance, because that's what we're talking about. The original one was AJM, which was the initials of the police officer that was actually taking the exhibit, and then obviously 54 was the sequential number that it was added to. But then it was, as I've explained, it was relabeled VW1. As Brendan's just explained, a subsample of that hair was then taken, which became VW1A, which we'll also hear about. There was K1, which is another subsample taken by the FBI, and then there's a completely different hair sample, RH17, which was the pristine sample taken at the site, so at the burial site. So the listeners will hear us refer to all these things as we go along, but it's a great way of thinking about it, that they are all parts of the same hair, and eventually the prosecution will attempt to bring that all together and say all these different samples had critical fibres on them that all prove from various points of the compass and points of the timeline that these fibres were all there at the critical moment when Ciara was killed.
And Tim, you mentioned one of these samples, the one which travelled overseas. And Brendan, we had a question relating to this from a listener yesterday who actually wanted to know the process of that. Does somebody accompany the sample on the plane, or is it put into a parcel post and, sent to the UK or to the FBI?
In most cases, it's actually physically accompanied by someone to go with it. That's the best method of maintaining that chain of custody, because as soon as you pass something over to the hands of, I suppose, a company or a freight mover outside of policing and outside of a government agency, you're introducing a new level of doubt there, and that's why we do things that way.
Yeah, and as we discussed yesterday, particularly in the case of the fingernails, which have the DNA on it, allegedly, we know, because Ms. Barbara Gallo has outlined it in the opening, that it was Laurie Webb from Path West, accompanied by a senior detective that physically took those critical fingernail exhibits with them on their person to the United States in specially forensically sealed packaging to basically, hopefully, from the prosecution point of view, ensure that continuity, so those two people will also obviously have documented it and then will be called in person to testify about how that process was undertaken.
Tim, you mentioned earlier that there were some inconsistencies by Gary Hyde. He admitted in some of the ways that he'd recorded the samples and what have you. Can you explain what some of those inconsistencies were? Were they in the transcribing or in the property tracing systems?
Yeah, actually both of those things, Nat. So when Mr. Hyde was at one of the crime scenes, it was his job to basically write down, or he was what they call the scribes, and he was documenting on site when an exhibit was taken, giving that a number, giving that a time of when it was taken, and a brief description of what it was. The main item that was of interest to Mr. Jovich today was actually an insect nest that had formed next to Ciara's body. When he wrote that down originally on the exhibit list, he said that it had been found above or over Ciara's body, but Mr. Hyde had described that he'd actually had an injury to his hand, and so his handwriting wasn't the best, and so his practice had become that he would take the original exhibit list on site, as was the protocol, but then he would try and neaten it up very soon afterwards, usually the next day, by writing it out again in a better handwriting, and probably in a more cleaner environment, if you like, and not at the scene of in the hot bush with a decomposing body there. So, and it was pointed out to him today that when he was transcribing this particular insect nest, that the information had changed. He said it had gone from being above the body to next to the body. And what Mr. Jovich then extrapolated out from that was, well, given how long ago this was, you basically had to rely on that information to then create your witness statements and to give your evidence in court this week. And his point was, well, if that information is wrong at the source point, then what's to say it doesn't become incorrect all the way along? And Mr. Hyde had to concede, well, yes, I'm human. That was obviously a transcription error. He said he would be absolutely sure that the description he'd given it on the day at the site would have been the right one, and that he had inadvertently transcribed it differently the following day. But Mr. Jovich was making the point, well, it might seem like a little thing, but if you're relying on that information then to provide statements to the police in very high-profile murder investigations and trials, as this now is, then that could become an issue.
Brendan, in terms of the actual evidence itself, it does seem like a minor detail, either beside the body or next or above the body. Are minor details like that important?
In some cases they are, but in other cases they can just be completely trivial. In an instance where you might be talking about an injury, for instance, really quite important where the positioning of the injuries or wounds are, and that's why forensic pathologists, for instance, use a very particular type of language in explaining areas on the human body and injuries and the like. Situations like this where next to, above, unless there is a story that goes to explaining how that it works against a defence case, I can't see the relevance, I can't see the importance.
Yeah. And what about this idea of how it was transcribed at the time? Have processes changed? Is that still the same thing that would happen now, or would someone have an iPad and would be punching in information? Has that progressed?
It's still best practice to actually make handwritten notes. You'll find that most people can do it quicker. Most people can actually take down more detail in making handwritten notes than using a tablet or a keyboard. It's not to say that we aren't introducing or haven't introduced technological advances to crime scenes, but there's value to the indelible nature of pen and paper, its permanency, the fact that if I make a mistake, I can cross it out, correct it, but the mistake still remains. It's not deleted and never known of, which is some of the issues you have with a technology-based example. The other thing is, if we're using computers, you've got to consider that crime scenes are often remote, and so a computer system that's using any sort of network connection, may suffer dropout from signal, and all of the stuff that we kind of get frustrated with our phones just in going about our normal business. The other concern with some of the technology approaches are that the security of these devices and this kind of black box nature of an iPad, that only Apple really knows how to access that and how to get into it. So can't go wrong with the good old pen and paper. And this is stuff that I drill into my students, is that you need to take great contemporaneous notes. You should be making really detailed notes, because in a situation like this where you're coming back 20 years later, they are your refresher. You have to consider that some of these guys that have been doing this for 20 years have been to tens of thousands of homicides. They've done this job tens of thousands of times, and it's almost an unreasonable expectation for them to remember every aspect of what they did on a day 20 years ago.
I think school teachers around the world are probably applauding you to hear that there is still a place for handwriting as opposed to iPads and technology. Tim, after the transcribing, then Gary Hyde was involved in the property tracing system. Can you talk to us about that part?
Yeah, so that's involves the technology that Brendan's just been talking about, actually, and the WA Police had a system which allowed them to then log in all the exhibits, give them a unique identifying number, and then that would enable the police, obviously, to be able to keep track of where they were, who touched them, and when, and for what purpose. And Mr. Hyde's evidence today was along the lines of several other police witnesses. In fact, all of the police witnesses who basically said that the property tracing system at the time was very, very rudimentary. It was clunky to use. It didn't allow them to have proper descriptors for the evidence that they were logging, and it basically restricted them in doing their job, because they weren't given the freedom to log everything that they might want to log about these pieces of evidence. Then they felt that at sometimes their hands were tied.
What were some of the errors that you heard about today?
Going to that PTS system, you had to. One of the requirements was to put a quantity of what exhibit you had taken, be it a hair sample, a sock sample, or a watch sample. And in this case, there was a watch that Mr. Hyde had placed into the property tracing system, but for some reason the quantity had been put as 4, which was a clear error, because there weren't 4 watches, there was just 1. And in another case, a hair sample had been placed in the PTS system, but the quantity had been put as 0, which obviously couldn't have been right, because if you didn't have a hair sample, you wouldn't put it in the PTS system at all. So once again, they were human errors, which obviously we all make all the time, which then become exaggerated and possibly a little bit inflated when looked back on in the context that we're looking back on them now. And again, if I'm going to make a judgment call, I would say not a critical error, but certainly an error and one that Mr. Jovich will use as one of the many grains of sand that he hopes he'll be able to put through the hourglass at the end of the case to show some reasonable doubt.
Brendan, we might go to some of these questions we have for you because there have been a lot of them in the past week. And when we spoke to you last time, you gave us an overview of how procedures should take place during a crime scene examination. We since heard that back then, in 1996, 1997, there was virtually no protocols for cross-contamination, not examination, and that the officers were wearing the protective gear mostly to protect their own clothing or themselves. So what are the risks if police enter a crime scene without booties, without gloves, without protective gear?
Yeah, gloves are an interesting one because gloves have a multifactorial use, I suppose, in a crime scene. They are predominantly, firstly, to protect you from any disease or anything that can harm, the actual person wearing them. The other two factors that are involved with wearing gloves are firstly for fingerprints, because they provide a barrier against your own fingers from depositing and contaminating, I suppose, a scene with your own fingerprints. And then, of course, we also have DNA, which, granted, in the mid-90s was not hugely understood in forensics in Australia. In fact, it was the mid-90s that DNA legislation was starting to come through in the UK and the US, and we followed shortly after that in the early 2000s with DNA legislation here in Australia. So gloves, I mean, there always was a consideration for fingerprints, but then you have to consider if you're picking up or touching exhibits that aren't likely to be a good receiving surface for a fingerprint. I'll use an example of a tree branch, that I can understand why that consideration wasn't there. Other protective equipment such as booties and kind of the disposable coveralls that we see now as the practice can also come with their own issues as well. Is that some of the booties, depending on the makeup of them, can actually get scuffed up and leave behind or introduce fibres and things to a scene themselves. It's all a matter of best practice at the time, and I think we heard this week that best practice at the time was actually using some sort of solution to scrub boots, which is probably just as equally effective as booties.
In Tuesday's podcast, Tim revealed to us this really something he had never seen before, and we had never heard of it. And this was the officer who had taken this hair sample of Jane Rimmer's and shampooed it and given it to the family. Is that something that would happen nowadays? We were quite surprised by this evidence.
I'd most likely say no. We've come a fair way since then. It's not to say that there's not acts of compassion that people feel compelled to do. Forensically, once the post-mortem examination has been done and that hair has been cleared, I suppose, we're at a stage there where the body's going to be released to a funeral home or back to the family anyway. So I guess it does seem a little bit odd, and it certainly is a talking point, but forensically I don't think there's any real concern with it.
So there's no necessarily great concern that part of the hair is now had this forensic detail that's gone missing, really, because the whole examination would have taken place.
Yeah, I suppose we'll never know, and that's the sort of question that they probably want to introduce from a defence perspective. But I've got pretty good faith in Karen Margolius's work. I actually worked with her myself a number of years ago, that if she determined that hair could be handed off and was clear of any evidence, that she's made a judgment call on that.
And having worked with her, I guess you would know her better than a lot of us. And I guess the thing was, it did seem like an extraordinarily compassionate thing to do, and that's, I guess, what it was.
And that was Karen. She was a really lovely, beautiful lady, and it's entirely the sort of thing that she would have done.
Yeah. We had questions that we were asking amongst ourselves about the knife that was found near the location of Jane Rimmer's body, and we haven't heard anything about any DNA being discovered on it. If something's in the open for a period of time, something, metal, would DNA show up on that later if there was any, or would the elements have washed it away? It's
such a random thing that it's impossible to categorically say. If there was DNA on it, there's certainly a huge range of things that can affect that. That can be weather, that can be moisture, that can actually be what sort of makeup the knife is. There could be there's particular metals that can have a degradative effect on DNA. So it's impossible to say that because there was nothing on it, does that actually mean anything? Because there may have never been anything on it. We're working on the assumption here that it was used in the commission of an offence, but we really have no idea.
Yeah. We have a question from Douglas Brook. He asks, were both samples, that of under Ciara's fingernails and the shorts from the Karrakatta rape victim, tested at the same time in the same lab because the link was suspected, or were they tested separately? Now, I know you won't know the answer to that exact question, but in a generic sense, would they be tested together if one was being brought out of storage and one was being tested? Would they still be kept quite separate?
You have to consider a modern DNA lab is very similar to, say, a pathology lab. They're getting in thousands of samples a week, and we've heard, historically about the thousands of samples that get processed for DNA here in WA. So samples all come in, and it's kind of like saying to someone that works in a pathology laboratory, "Oh, did you test John's sample and Mary's sample on the same run?" And people will inevitably say, I have no idea. We have paperwork that we can go back and check, as will a DNA lab. They'll have paperwork that they can go back and check. But all of these samples kind of funnel into a laboratory through like a receival point or a central entry point, and then they kind of become these faceless tubes that just then go into the lab, and these tubes just are identified by, say, a barcode number or a unique number of some sort. There's one of those numbers again, and then they're just lined up in a rack, and they're just processed one after the other. Now, what sits in that rack in front of any given scientist on any given day is anyone's guess. There could be two samples from unrelated cases on that same rack. However, it's best practice in any forensic laboratory to minimise the chance of any sort of crossover between those. So we exercise cautions along things like ensuring that only a single tube is ever open at the same time. We do things like ensure that if we have to transfer something from one tube to another, that there's a second person that might check that or sign for that or watch that, or check that there's no transcription errors. So while there's always scope, I think, as I said last week, there's a huge number of checks and balances put in place to mitigate any sort of issue that can happen there. So I guess the short answer is it's entirely possible that two samples sat together next to each other, but the chance of those being cross-contaminated should be very, very, very low.
And I'll just jump in there, Nat, just with a couple of little factual things about that question. It's not the actual shorts of the Karrakatta victim that provided Mr. Edwards' DNA. It was the intimate swabs that were taken from that victim by Dr. Barnard, who we heard from earlier in the week. So it was those swabs that were then had the DNA extracted out of them, which was then tested and came back positive for a male a male provider of that sample, which then turned out to be Mr. Edwards. So if the listener has an image of these shorts lying on a bench and then this DNA sample sort of lying next to it on a bench, it certainly wasn't that scenario. And just going to Brendan's point then about the tubes not being opened at the same time, I was actually rereading the opening statement today, just brushing up on my DNA because I knew that Brendan was coming on, and Miss Barbagallo made the specific point that when the DNA was being extracted from all of Ciara's fingernail samples, so obviously 10 of those were taken or labelled, only one of those tubes was ever opened at the one time, so they didn't have all 10 on the bench sort of lying there all open at the same time. They extracted one piece, opened one tube, did the procedure to get the DNA off it, closed it up, and went on to another one. So we all know this contamination point is going to be the major point when the DNA evidence comes up, and obviously those processes at Path West will be absolutely forensically examined, if you pardon the pun.
And Brendan, is it the scientist who, I guess at the end of it all, sees that match and goes, oh, I've got this, and hands that to police? Or is all the information passed on to police and police then, plough through it and see that match?
The scientist does the interpretation of the results and identifies the link. So the John Smith matches the sample from crime scene B, and they then provide that in a report to the police.
Well, thank you very much. It's a fascinating field, and we thank you for your expertise and helping us plough through all that. Thank you, Tim, for your time in court today.
Pleasure.
Email us at claremontpodcast@wanews.com.au. For more exhibits and any more information, you can go to thewest.com.au. We'll be back tomorrow for day 27 with Ali and Tim to wrap up week 6 of Claremont in Conversation. Join us then.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorno, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.